Hi, my name is Charlie Loving, and this is my presentation on sexual violence among the incarcerated, what I consider an endemic issue. Thank you.
All right. Before we begin, you might notice that my head's on top of this little correctional officer sprite, and that's going to be a constant throughout the presentation, is to make it a little bit more interactive. And I thought it might look pretty cool, but we'll see. I don't know. Hopefully, it'll be received well. But anyways, let's get started. So, the goal of this presentation is to educate the public about a hidden epidemic: sexual violence within the United States correctional system. Far too often, the suffering of incarcerated individuals remains invisible. Today, we'll explore the prevalence, the causes, the vulnerable groups affected, the efforts made to address these issues, and where we can go from here as a society. We're going to be talking about concepts, or I guess more like legislation like PREA, which is Prison Rape Elimination Act, and the shortcomings of PREA, as well as what I personally recommend we might be able to do in order to improve the effectiveness of legislation like PREA and perhaps even the implementation of new legislation along those same lines.
All right, before getting into the proverbial meat and potatoes of my presentation, I'd like to bring home the reality. 1 in 10 prisoners report being sexually victimized while incarcerated, but this number likely underestimates the problem. Sexual violence in prisons and jails is both widespread and deeply underreported, contributing to what criminologists call the dark figure of crime, essentially acts that occur but are never reported. Both men and women are victimized not just by other inmates, but also by correctional staff in certain instances. The correctional system has become an environment where violence, including sexual violence, is alarmingly normalized.
All right, after we've now discussed the reality of the situation, I want to provide a deeper outlook into the extent of the issue as it affects the correctional system. Sexual violence in the correctional system is an issue that crosses all boundaries. Both men and women are victimized at alarming rates, with no facility type, jail, prison, or detention center being immune. Victimization is not limited to inmate on inmate incidents. Correctional staff are also implicated in a number of disturbing cases. Yes, the true extent of this violence is difficult to measure. Most assaults go unreported, contributing to what I said previously, the dark figure of crime. Additionally, fear of retaliation, institutional indifference, and shame are just a few of the reasons why survivors choose to withhold or lack to disclose their abuse. As a result, the reality we know is only a fraction of the reality that exists behind prison walls. While there are a few methods by which inmates can voice their grievances, these systems are often lackluster and have a poor response rate, leading to these issues becoming exacerbated until they're dangerous for the inmate's well being. Thank you. Now that we've discussed both the reality of the situation as well as its extent, I want to discuss some of the contributing factors which exacerbate this issue. Several factors sustain this epidemic. Firstly, a cultural violence within the correctional system encourages the use of sexual violence as a form of domination from inmate to inmate, as well as correctional officer to inmate in regards to sexual violence. Furthermore, the unwritten prison code discourages the disclosure of sexual violence and abuse as a form of snitching, which can irreparably damage one's reputation behind bars. Furthermore, the misuse of power by staff, i.e., using authority as a form of punishment, can further dissuade inmates from using systems like the grievance system to address their concerns regarding their sexual abuse, especially from correctional staff. Furthermore, complex staff inmate relationships sometimes blur the professional boundaries of the correctional system, which further dissuades these instances from being reported upon for fear of correctional officer retaliation within the prison system itself. And lastly, and most crucially, intersectionality, essentially the intersection of multiple identities, i.e., race, culture, ethnicity, so and so, intersect to make some inmates even more vulnerable than others in terms of sexual abuse within the correctional system. We'll discuss that in the next slide. All right, as I mentioned in the previous slide, intersectionality contributes to the increased vulnerability of certain populations within the prison system, specifically populations like the LGBTQIA population, first time offenders, as well as the mentally ill. Correctional sexual violence does not affect all groups equally. As I said, LGBTQIA individuals, first time offenders, and those living with mental health illness face much higher risks of victimization. These populations are not only more likely to experience victimization, but are also much less likely to be believed when they report it. And this statistic at the bottom shows that 59% of transgender women in the California state prisons report sexual abuse, compared to 4% of non transgender men. This statistic provides a brief look into the disparity in terms of sexual violence experiences between intersectional groups and non intersectional groups. All right, so now that we've discussed the reality, the extent, and the contributing factors to correctional sexual violence, I want to discuss what's being done to address it currently. So, in terms of legislation, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, established in 2003, was established in response to alarming rates of sexual violence within corrections. Now, what exactly did PREA do? First of all, PREA improved funding for preventative programs and provided training for correctional staff in order to address/identify correctional sexual violence and prevent it in the future. Furthermore, PREA established greater standards for data collection regarding these sorts of crimes, which can help contribute to the overall national view of the issue and what we can do to address it as a country. And additionally, PREA established a zero tolerance policy for correctional sexual violence nationally and encouraged correctional facilities/state prisons to address the issue in the way they see fit. And lastly, PREA helped establish a greater education for inmates regarding their rights and responsibilities, as well as legal protections regarding sexual violence and how they should respond to it moving forward. While I think PREA is generally a step in the right direction, I think a lot more could be done in regards to its efficacy as well as enforcement, but we'll discuss that on the next slide. All right, so as I mentioned on the previous slide, PREA has some significant shortcomings. First of all, PREA's enforcement remains largely voluntary. Furthermore, interpretations of its policies are inconsistent across the facilities in which it is enforced, and it primarily targets inmate on inmate violence and often neglects the staff misconduct in regards to correctional officer on inmate sexual violence, which is, I consider, a much more complex issue that should be addressed first, considering, the correctional officers have a duty to contain these people, not victimize them. Additionally, misinterpretations of PREA at times have hurt vulnerable communities like the LGBTQIA plus inmate population, leading to greater isolation and punishment instead of the protection in which it was supposed to be established for. Finally, PREA does not create a private right of action, meaning individuals cannot sue based on PREA violations. Essentially, if PREA is found to be ineffective for a certain inmate, they have no legal grounds to stand on in order to, I guess, fight the state in regards to PREA's failure to address their grievances/abuse, especially in regards to correctional officer on inmate situations, which, as you can obviously imagine, is incredibly, I would just say, wrong.
PREA pointed us in the right direction, but it's only the beginning. Here's what we must demand: mandatory, substantial enforcement of PREA standards across all states, an increased federal penalty for facilities that fail to comply to PREA standards, and greater transparency and independent oversight of these correctional facilities. Furthermore, sexual violence behind bars should not remain an invisible issue. We have a moral obligation to speak for those voices who are never heard, and I believe presentations like these and addressing the issue itself is a step in the right direction. Today, you've heard the reality of correctional sexual violence. You've learned about its extent, its causes, the populations most affected, the limitations of our current laws, and the path forward. We must not remain silent. Every voice matters. Every life matters. We must speak for those whose voices are never heard. Thank you, and I hope you got something from this.